Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Dan, for this wonderful opportunity of being here. Second time in this beautiful city. And what I'm going to do is to present this topic, this question that I think that is fascinating. I hope that you will find it that because we have some knowledge about this topic, this area of research, but we also have a lot of unknowns. And I think that this is where it gets very, very exciting. So I'm gonna first, we are gonna talk about respiratory infections, but we actually are gonna focus on influenza because it's fascinating how this is such a known disease. Everybody has it every year. It has been like it causes a pandemic that was a disaster, as you know, in 1918. But if I ask you, why do we get influenza in winter? And actually, if I ask the same question to any researcher in the world, the right answer is we don't know, okay? So there are several theories, and I'm going to try to show you this because this is very well related, not only with influenza, but with many other respiratory diseases. We still don't know that. So we have good guesses. Every one of us say, oh, it's, it's cold, there are a lot of people together, whatever. I'm going to show you some of the basis for these theories. But something so basic, we still don't know. So you guys that are used to get Nobel Prizes, you should go and try to sort this out because it's time to do it. Seasonality of respiratory infections. So we are going to deal with these three things, okay? What is it? The causative explanations, so all the theories, and some of the methodological challenges. So this is a little bit of I like to rant a little bit, so the last session, if you are still around, you will hear about some of the things that I think that are interesting about what we can improve in some of the ways we do research in this field. So seasonality. First, let's understand what is seasonality. Seasonality is some rhythm that you have, in your data. Okay. So this is, for instance, we download the data from the WHO about influenza, and then this is a very nice way, by the way, of plotting your data. If you have data, that comes from a lot of places, those are countries, and then you have time series, start doing this, because you have this powerful computing machine that is the brain and can already see stuff going on, okay? So you have, and if you sorted it in a meaningful way, like a latitudinal gradient, you can already see things going on. So in the north hemisphere, in a high latitude, you have things going in a rhythm. And actually, if you look at that, it doesn't coincide with the southern hemisphere because, of course, it's winter there, it's winter down here, and in the middle is the tropical areas that we will see that are very complicated and, in some sense, more fascinating. So seasonality, you have a season, a signal, and then you can use several models. You can use one model here. We happen to use a Fourier analysis, and then you get this. You simplify the information, and then you have a peak, a difference between the peak and the throw, and this you have a wave height. Why am I explaining that? Because the strength of seasonality is something interesting in itself. So this will be, another place, but here you would say that is a weak seasonality, okay? Because this wave weight is smaller than this one. So this is like, influenza or mortality of pneumonia, in a temperate country, and this will be in a tropical country. So why is that important? Because you have a complex things going on here, but it's something that you can reduce to some parameters. And when you reduce, you extract parameters, it's very good because you can compare them across latitudes or across age groups, or and then is when things get interesting. So for instance, here you have the peak time, is a very interesting thing. So this happens in summer, this happens in winter, happens in between. And then you have the wave weight. So when you do that, you can generate things like this that we did in Brazil, when you see that here, in the south, this is the Tropic of Capricorn, so this will be the tropical region. Here, you have a strong, amplitude of seasonality. So in winter, you have a lot of death caused by pneumonia and influenza, and in summer, not so many, as opposed to here. And interesting enough, they start to increase, because this is the latitude, when you get close to the equatorial line. So this is something that you can do with seasonal parameters, or the peak time. That is fascinating as well, because these happen to be later in the year than those ones in the north, something that we didn't expect. We expect that influenza would first arrive here every year and then spread to the remainder of the country. And this, as we will see, it's one of the reasons that we believe that is because this coincides with winter, so what happens in winter, and this coincides with the rainy season in the tropics. So if you interpolate, this is an interpolation we are starting to do with data. You interpolate the timing of the influenza, you see that the tropical areas are the ones that are more interesting. The temperate ones are kind of boring. They happen all the same. Here it's in this time of the year, January, February, when they peak, and here is on on July, June, and so on. Said that, seasonality is seasonality is interesting per se, but also sometimes what we want to study is what goes beyond seasonality. So we describe seasonality and we remove it to find the interesting stuff, So this is the case for when you are looking at pandemics. Then you have to use seasonality, not because you are interested in seasonality, but to know what happens every year, So you have the rhythm, and then what you do is you make a model that does not include the year that you are looking at, And then you see the excess. So this is the 2009 pandemic, data from Brazil. And then this is what you had of excess of death, So this is also an interesting information that you can plot through latitudes again and see that actually in the south of Brazil, again, it dies much more people than what happened in the north of Brazil. Something fascinating and something that some models didn't take into account when they estimate the global burden of the pandemic, and they said that in the tropics were the same. They extrapolated the data to the tropics, and that's not the case as what we saw in Brazil. You really have more death in the temperate regions than in the And this is actually in the equatorial regions. And that is fascinating for some things that we're going to see. Perhaps people don't die as much of influenza and other respiratory infections in the tropics as they do, other things being equal of course, socioeconomics and so on, as they do in the temperate regions. If you wonder if I like this sort of thing, could I do it? Yes, you can. You go to cemeteries, you go to archives, you get this sort of information. You get a student to transcribe that and create tables, of course. And then you have very interesting things that you can look at. So this is we did just for fun in Brazil, in the city I live, So this was a student there that did this beautiful work, and we published in Vaccine, showing the pandemics, the impact of the pandemic in Florianopolis. And you can do that with this program. Sorry, I pressed the eject button, I guess, here, which is, how does it? Oh, thank you. So this is a program that we wrote, and you can use it for free and to do all these analyses and all the ones you have here. So people in any part of the world can do this sort of research on time series, and it compares the data across latitudes and so on. Okay. So going back to acute respiratory infections, they are the most common illness in humans. 5.5 million deaths per year. Main cause of childhood mortality, and diagnosis and attribution difficult and uncertain. A lot of viruses going on. You don't know what is causing the death. Underlying drivers include malnutrition, pollution, overcrowding, and tobacco use. And you can see where are the regions that are more affected by the respiratory infections. This is an interesting graphic because it's a model of us on in respect to diseases, to infections, you know. So those are actually the ways that infections can enter us, you know, through the alimentary system, through the, of course, respiratory system, from the genital, you know, so sexual diseases and so on. So if you look at these historical data sets, they're fascinating because a lot of the diseases, you know, mainly the diarrhea, the vector-borne diseases, they've been decreasing a lot. But we are not so lucky with the respiratory ones. Of course, we had vaccines, we have a lot of things that are improving, but we still have a lot of death by respiratory. Why is that? Because here, if you look at these organisms, you can remember that, okay, well, food, we can kind of treat food. You can do sanitation. You can break the ways that these things enter, okay? Sexual transmission, you can use preventive measures. But air, we have to breathe air, and then we always have a door of entrance for the respiratory infections, okay? So this is still, if you want, is the most difficult infection group to get rid of. And you have several viruses that take advantage. So this is in another place of Brazil, Fortaleza. So this is pediatric data, and you have a lot of things going on there. And those are the ones that we don't know, you know. but you have RSV, parainfluenza, pneumovirus, adenovirus, influenza, and so on, you see? And it's interesting that in kids, you have a lot of RSV there, as you know from other parts of the world as well. But the same problem, so this is actually the rainy season there, as you can see. So the things that I'm going to discuss for influenza are valid in a great extent for the other disease. Despite that said, there are some of them, you know, like parainfluenza that they go through all the year. And this is another layer of complication of this question that I'm not going to discuss, even because I don't know the answer as well. Nobody knows yet. So respiratory tract, you have upper respiratory tract infections, the ones that install mainly here. The virus reproduces here, and then when things get dicer, they come here, and then it can be much more much more severe, okay? This difference is interesting for aspects like the way that some virus, for the transmission of the virus, because some of them can go up, down there for mechanisms that we will try to see. Winter seasonality has been reported for a wide range of upper respiratory tract infections caused by 200 different viruses, okay, belonging to these families. But lower respiratory tract diseases, such as pneumonia, viral or bacteria, also show a similar seasonal pattern, okay? So I'm not talk about bacteria. You have here Dan Weinberger that knows much more than that about me. But it's interesting to see that many other diseases that you even don't think that are respiratory, they actually had seasonal patterns and are related probably with their respiratory way of transmission as well. Like smallpox, this is it was this horrible disease that has been eliminated 30 years ago. It also had actually very interesting pattern, you know, and this is probably because the way that it was transmitted is after you had this very nasty things that explode, and that was aerosolized, and then people would breathe that, and that was the worst way of transmission of the disease. So just by having this respiratory part of their cycle, you had some interesting pattern. And the things that we study for influenza probably will help to understand why we had these patterns in the past that fortunately we don't see anymore because this disease has been eradicated. Other interesting stuff, these are diarrheal disease. Okay, you say, oh, well, so why are we looking at the diarrhea, diarrhea time series here? Well, in the past, this is Mexico, okay? So in the past, what you used to have is diarrhea deaths that were in summer. So you had these huge summer peaks. And then as you move, to more recent years, actually you get rid of the summer ones, and this actually is in winter, okay? Middle of the year, beginning of the year. And so those are not longer probably bacterial death, but now those are bacterial death, diarrhea, and this is viral diarrhea, okay? Fascinatingly enough, for reasons that we still don't understand, these winter diarrhea, rotavirus and so on, they follow the same pattern as influenza or other respiratory diseases. Why? We still don't know. So this is the timing of, for instance, rotavirus diseases, and it follows the same pattern as respiratory ones. If this is a latitudinal gradient, so this is the northern countries, and then this is the southern hemisphere, and this is the timing. So here they are more aggregated in the winter time, and here as well in the winter time. Causative explanations. So let's first talk about the general causes of seasonality of infectious diseases quickly. So survival of pathogen outside the host. You have some microclimates, some water that is out there, and that in summer the conditions are better for bacteria to multiply, and is when you have the peak of diarrhea, for instance, as we saw in Mexico. Host behavior. So for instance, the summer holidays, people have changing patterns in partners, not patterns. Partners pattern, and they got more gonorrhea, for instance. This happens. Host immune fusion function. So you have, for instance, in some places that get very dry and dusty in Africa, so you have more meningitis in those times of the year. And of course, abundance of vectors and non-human hosts. That when malaria, dengue, and so on, they depend on the seasons where the mosquitoes are around. So we are not going to talk more about the vector and non-human hosts in respiratory diseases because they don't depend on that, other than you probably have heard about the thing about birds and influenza. So the thing about birds and influenza is because the natural reservoir of influenza is actually wild animals. And then how they are introduced from time to time, that is when we have the pandemics and so on, can follow, the risk of introducing can follow some seasonal patterns, okay? But this has nothing to do with the seasonal patterns that we have. It's just that there are some times where the birds, that have the avian influenza, they are around those hotspots, they can introduce into the human population new variants. But that's all what we're going to talk about, vectors and non-human hosts and respiratory diseases. So we actually made this kind of framework of the putative relationship and causal connections among key seasonal stimuli, mediating mechanism, and influenza epidemics. Okay, so those will be the mediating mechanism. I added the transport in virus survival for reasons we are going to see, and immunity and contact rate. So you saw that apart from the vector one, we have the three ones here. And we have seasonal stimuli. And by putting this whole scheme here, I don't want to pass the impression that everything is important. No, I am putting everything here because those are all the theories that are out there. We still don't know which ones are the correct ones. Okay, so this is the size of the problem. So let's walk a little bit in the throughout the different theories, and probably you're going to find your favorite one here among these ones that I'm going to show. So temperature and contact rate. Okay, this is actually the most accepted hypothesis, and is the one that we usually listen in the news and so on. Oh, people, they are more time indoors, so they get to contact more in winter, so that's. I actually don't believe that. I mean, individuals, for instance, individuals spend on average 1 to 2 hours more time indoors during cold weather in the USA, okay? And this will be as well valid for the tropics, because it rains more, and then you have people more time indoors during rain weather conditions. Well, what's the problems? And this is why I don't think that this is a strong theory. I think that this difference seems minimal in the 20 hours of the day, mainly in current crowded conditions, that we live in urban areas. So I don't know if you guys see each other more in winter than in summer, but I think that's basically the same. The contact rate here or in metros, and there is no empirical data for that. So here there is room for research. Social behavior, so school calendars, calendar of festivities could also drive influenza. And you have some problems with the support to this theory that is contradictory data. Some places you find something, like in France, they found that holidays reduce transmission about kids 20 to 30%, but not in other places. And is inconsistent the seasonal patterns we see with the school calendar. So influenza peaks during the winter in temperate locations and not during fall or spring holiday. And and the holidays don't coincide as they should. Tropical epidemics do not necessarily overlap with the school calendar. What about major events? So in Brazil, we saw, again, we have, so these are data from the green, correspond to the green. This is the data from, mainly from Belém in the Amazon. So you see this is the rainy season, and then you have more influenza circulating. But actually, from the data of some years, we saw a peak here, out of phase. So, okay, let's try to look at that. And then at that time of the year, actually you have one of the biggest religious events in the world. So you have people coming from in all sorts of ways, to the city. And then you say, well, maybe this is driving seasonality in some way there, or that peak. And then it's, let me skip this one. But then what we found is that the peaks, these only happen in 1 year. So it was exactly when the time of the event in 1 year, but not enough to drive seasonality other years. So it's not ruled out that social events can sporadically trigger a cycle of transmission. But there is little support that social events drive seasonal patterns, okay? And then, so the theory that changes in contact rate drive seasonal pattern of influenza and other respiratory disease remain one of the most persistent myths in the field, because there is not hard data, not because it's necessarily wrong. It can be wrong, but people just reproduce this without having still enough empirical data. Another one, then. Now we move to the survival and transport of pathogens outside hosts. So when we sneeze, we cough, the virus did the trick of activating us to expel it to outside, okay? It did the job of multiplying inside us, and now it needs to go to another one. And one way, very clever way of doing that is to stimulate us to release in a very strong way, the things out there. But then it has to reach another host, right? Clever guy. He, before anybody else, he was already speculating about that people often catch colds from one another when shut up together in closed rooms, coats, etc., and when sitting near and conversing so as to breathe in each other's transpiration. So this is just to pay an homage. Before they knew about, the germ theory and so on, Benjamin Franklin were already thinking of what we are talking here. And then so the main routes is this. So this virus that is here, if he wants to get here, we think that those are the ways he can do it. One is the airborne transport, so people sneeze and somebody else is gonna inhale that virus straight away. And then this can be with aerosols and droplets. Depending on the size, as we are gonna see, they can have a different route. They can just float until they reach here, or they can actually come in intermediate objects, contaminate them. You put your hand on that, and because we are all the time touching our faces and so on, you will self-inoculate the virus, okay? And this is the size of this is a hair, human hair. This is sand, beach sand, and this will be the size of the red ones here of the aerosols that can float from one bit to the other. And 40% is contained when we sneeze. Is contained in this size, okay? The aerosolized form when we. So what is out there when the when the virus is out there before it reaches the other host? Something that actually can stop it from going there is several conditions, environmental conditions. One there that has been speculated is solar radiation. Okay, so since they have, the virus, they have sensitivity to UV radiation. They get destroyed, they get inactivated during low sun seasons. Okay, the problems, perhaps, of this theory is that the amount of UV indoors, where a large proportion of influenza transmission probably occurs, is constant. Okay, so we still don't know about that. It's a possibility. Humidity. So this is a big one actually, and there, as you will see. So the lip envelope encasing the virus remains intact longer when the air is sufficiently cold and dry. As the aerosolized virus particle enters the upper respiratory tract, the envelope melts, exposing the virus to healthy host cells. So it's fascinating how many studies actually saw that in low humidity, as you can see in those simplification of graphics, you have a higher virus survival. Okay, low humidity, virus survival bigger. In this study, they had an increase after certain threshold. And then so some experiments are very interesting. So they use mannequins actually. One is the one that is the coughing simulator, and the other the breathing simulator. And then they measure, the percentage of virus that retains infectivity relative to prior coughing. So very, trying to simulate a realistic situation. And then they collected the samples during 60 minutes. And again, as you can see in the graphic, in conditions of low relativity, the infectivity remains very high. But if you put in a wet environment, it gets, the survival gets very low. And this happens with a different size of the particles. I'm going to skip this one. And another very interesting experiment is actually with ferrets. So what you do here is you put one ferret that is infected with influenza in one cage, and then you put another one, or guinea pigs, but they do this with ferrets as well. So yeah, really. And then what you do, you send an airflow in this direction, and then you see, this is the nasal wash titer, of influenza virus in the infected. Of course, it gets decreasing as after the animal gets sick. But then the other one, the spores, has a peak. Okay, so when you have a low relative humidity, the transmission is 100%. This is amazing. But when it's in high relative humidity, the transmission is 0. So this is a very strong argument in this sense, Very powerful. And then it is when you have that. So the temperature here it was 20 degrees. When the temperature is low, actually what you have is that it happens the same, okay? So transmission 100% at low relative humidity, 50% here. At you see, when the temperature is low, it gets you still get transmission, but lower in high humidity. In warm weather, they only did one set of experiments. So, and you can see that in 30 degrees, the guinea pigs, they have zero transmission when you have a low relative humidity. So the virus somehow doesn't like also the warm weather. So, and the temperature, with temperature we were talking about humidity, but with temperature we have the same sort of virus survival and virus stability, sort of shape, so it increases, it decreases as the temperature increases. And when you put everything together and you get absolute humidity, you still have this relation. So, because airborne transmission seems to be more sensitive to changes in temperature and humidity, it has been hypothesized that the dominant mode of will be airborne route in temperate regions and droplet mode in tropics. So, that looks conclusive enough, right? But why, despite all support, we can still conclude that we cannot conclude that virus survival is the mechanism driving the seasonality of respiratory infections? Well, first, the viruses might be so fragile because they do not actually. Okay, it is not well written. But the message is that the virus they perhaps are so fragile, that they actually cannot stand anyway. Sometime, outside. So viruses that persist in the extracellular environment for considerable periods must be more stable than those that pass quickly from one host to the next. So what I mean is that perhaps the influenza virus, the respiratory virus, they actually don't need to resist to stand environmental conditions because they go quickly from one host to the other. So these viruses are often unstable outside the body. Spreading requires close person-to-person contact, is this what this author said. Another problem is that this hypothesis does not explain data from tropical areas, okay, when you have a high humidity coincides with the epidemic season. And the third alternatives have a perhaps more solid perhaps the alternative theories have, we don't know, perhaps more solid biological basis. That is my belief, actually. I think that because our respiratory tract is exposed much longer to external conditions that the respiratory virus are, it seems reasonable to suspect that respiratory infections may be mediated by changes in the respiratory tract. So, let's explore this possibility. This gentleman, he was the one that discovered that actually shingles were caused by chickenpox, actually, and he was at the core of the debate of the role of population immunity and overall susceptibility to infection. And he proposed that the simultaneous, what happens is that you have the virus circulating in in symptomless hosts. But then when you have the right conditions, your immune system somehow lower its capability of fighting against them, and then is when you get symptomatic influenza or symptomatic illness. And he defended that the seasonal stimulus for that was deficiency in vitamin D. It makes sense because vitamin D it acts as an immune system modulator, right? And some clinical trials test actually if vitamin D supplements affect the incidence of influenza in school-age children, and they had mixed results. So here is actually another idea for an experiment. You can vitamin D you can get in, from a CVS, and then you can give to some people, and to others you give placebo and see if they have less influenza or respiratory disease. This is something that will be very interesting to perform this experiment. So we have challenged to allocate resource between immunity and other expensive physiological process, thermal regulation. So, for instance, when you are actually fighting, if you are in winter, you have to take care of temperature, of nutrition, you sometimes get wet and this and that. So this is a location of resource, of energy, that probably you are removing from being able to fight a disease. So this is another possibility. And then nutrition as well, okay? And in nutrition, let's just me open a parenthesis. This is an interesting, this study we are doing, actually, we got these records from Chinese 15th century medical officer from the Ming dynasty. And you know that at that problem they didn't have a lot of, at that time they didn't have a lot of problem of using people, to do experiments. And then they used to, so from some part of them they forced ingestion of lime water, Then diet consisted only of rice and vegetables. The exposure to abrupt temperatures change. And then to the lucky ones they gave soup, and so on. And actually, this is from the design point of view, it's perhaps this is actually the first clinical trial documented in history. It's very fascinating. And they use 50 individuals in each of these groups, okay? The problem is that they didn't introspect very well their groups. They had to be good, because they could be beheaded and so on by the emperors. This is if they didn't get, the good, treatment to the emperor family. So they really did very good experiments from the point of view of design. But this was not well introspect. But it's fascinating, but because that experiment at that time can give us results that all the prisoners that had this treatment, that they were nutritionally suppressed, they actually developed ILA symptoms, okay, cold. And only a few prisoners developed in this group. So very interesting historic data. Seasonal exposure to cold air causes an increase in the incidence of upper respiratory tract infections due to cooling of the nasal airway. Okay. This is my favorite hypothesis, okay? I'm going to tell about my favorite one here. This guy, Eccles, from Wales, he published this paper, and I think that for me is the one that is my favorite, the one that I would like to see experiments trying to refutate or collaborate. So, an image for you here. Okay, so the seasonal exposure to cold air causes an increase in the incidence, okay? Because it affects the nasal airway. He had a figure there that every day we breathe 14,000 liters of air. Say, well, how much is that? So this is, I Google it, and it came this image. This is a 14,000 liters, tank. So this is what each one of us, put inside our lung and send back to the atmosphere per day. This is a huge amount of things, that can be. So this is the amount of, what I mean is this is the amount of atmosphere that we put inside this very fragile part of us that is the respiratory epithelium, okay? Because we need to do the exchange of gases in the lungs, because we need to keep it wet and so on. It's not like skin, that is very well protected. So you are bringing this huge amount of air in contact to something that is basically perhaps not that prepared for doing that. Well, it is because we are alive, but So the theory of the guy is this one. You have breathing of cold air. Because of that, the temperature of the nasal epithelium decreases, right? And then the mucociliary clearance activity of your cell there and the phagocytic activity, they also decrease. Because of that, you have an increased susceptibility to infection that leads to upper respiratory tract infections. I think that this makes a lot of sense because when you expose this epithelium, of your respiratory tract, what you have is some very interesting defenses. So you have the secreted mucus, that is a liquid viscous thing that actually is going to get the dust and the virus and all of that, and with the movements of the cilia is going to bring to some place that you can swallow that and take to your digestive system where it's going to be destroyed. So this is the part where you can break the defense. You can, with cold air, with offensive circumstances, you can break that and open the window for the entrance of pathogens. This, for me, makes a lot of sense. And then the problems, some experiments with the guinea pigs that I think that I'm not going to be able to go through them, but but we can handle that criticism. And then another one is, let me just give you an idea of another experiment here, right? So I think that will be very interesting. I was mentioning to Ginny today one experiment that will be very cool to do, is if you detect, putative changes in the respiratory epithelium, of a population prior of the time of when people get infected. So the changes in the respiratory epithelium could not be attributed to the virus themselves, but to the conditions that you are exposed. And then you will see if after these conditions you would have more invasion of virus. I think that this will be very conclusive. And you could do it just with the nasal swabs from hospitals and so on. The problems, another problem is actually that does not explain the circulation in the tropics, right? Because in the tropics you would think, well, when it's rainy, why you would have your epithelium being affected by these conditions? So those are some of the ideas that I've been discussing with this researcher. Changes in the viscosity of the epithelium mucosa. You can have perhaps in the same way when you breathe this, when you put these machines to clean your throat and all of that, maybe the damp conditions of the tropic also change the viscosity of the epithelium. And that could open perhaps the windows to infections. Frequency of mouth respiration, allowing pathogens to bypass defense systems. So when it's hot and wet, people breathe more with the mouth. So that maybe bypass your defenses, of the nose. It's a speculation. And well, I read this in the literature. More allergens in damp conditions could facilitate the damage to epithelium, hence viral invasion. So those will be the part regarding to the causal factors. Let me just change a little bit gear, and I think that perhaps this will be the last one because, how are we on time? Yeah. Examples of practical implications of the current theories to public health. So this is fascinating not only because the scientific things, but because when you are giving recommendations of what you should do, the mechanisms and the environmental routes, they change. If it's one or the other, actually change completely radically the recommendations that you would give. So, for instance, if it's nasal airway, one solution will be what you should recommend people is to use a scarf, because then you avoid a lot of cold air getting into you and doing that damage, So, old people. They die more in winter, so the use of a scarf of respiratory disease, so the use of a scarf looks like a sensible thing to recommend to them to do. if it's viral survival, actually, and not this, actually, what causes more death in winter, the viral survival, so the recommendation is completely different. You will say, okay, so what you have to do is to humidify indoor air, for instance. This would be one of them. Or you would, for instance, also, so here, and then the environmental routes. If it's aerosol, you would say isolation or use of face mask, okay? If the virus goes floating into the air. This is what you have to do. But if it's self-inoculation by hand, as we saw the other route, the other possibility that we don't know, then it's washing hands. Okay, so you can see that actually the whole basis of the recommendations for the 2000 pandemic actually was based on the assumptions that that the virus would transmit into by hand, by self-inoculation, okay? Because the main recommendation was washing hands. And actually we published an article that's showing that even if so, that wouldn't be a big difference because people have a lot of opportunities to recontaminate their hands in between wash-handing events, okay? I think that it's time for me. I have plenty of things to talk the whole afternoon here, but I will not bore you. I think that I can finish because it's time to that, and if you have questions, we have some time too. Okay, thank you.